Good morning. My name is William Kirk. I am an Associate Vice President of the University. To all of you, but especially to those of you visiting Notre Dame from afar, I offer you my warm welcome. It's my great privilege and pleasure to serve as chair of this session of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture's 9th Annual Fall Conference on the Family, Searching for Fairest Love. The specially invited author of this morning's paper, Msgr. Charles J. Brown, is a loyal son of Notre Dame, graduated from the university with a degree in history. Msgr. Brown continued his studies in theology at Oxford in medieval studies at the University of Toronto and was awarded his doctorate in sacramental theology from the Pontifical Athenaeum Sant'Anselmo in Rome. A priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Msgr. Brown has worked for the past 14 years as an official in the oldest of the Roman Catholic Church's Curia's 9 congregations, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which was led through most of that time by a prince of the church you might recognize the name of, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. Cardinal Ratzinger and the congregation, with Msgr. Brown's assistance, defended the church from heresy and defended those points of Christian tradition which seem in danger because of new and unacceptable doctrines. I have been blessed to know Msgr. Brown for several years now, meeting him while he was engaged in scholarly research here at Notre Dame on the topic which he will discuss with us today. That being the bishop as Sponsus ecclesiae particularis, family structures and ecclesiological developments in the first millennium. While my Latin is a bit rusty since I took it from Jesuits many years ago, I nonetheless personally know that Msgr. Brown is especially qualified to speak on this topic. My family can gratefully attest to the fact that Msgr. Charlie has been so generous and so lovingly faithful to Pope John Paul's exhortation in Familiaris Consortio to serve as an agent of the pastoral care of the family. It is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce to you Msgr. Charles Brown.
I thank Bill Kirk for his really kind words. I don't recognize myself in all these laudatory comments, but he's very, very kind. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, it's a tremendous joy for me to be speaking here at the 9th Annual Fall Conference of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. I owe much respect and much gratitude to David Solomon for having invited me to this conference, which, as I said to someone earlier this week, is a true embarrassment of riches. When you look at the magnificent talks and seminars that are being offered throughout these days, one feels frustrated that one cannot be present for all of the talks, because it's just so excellent. I'm, as Bill said, going to speak about a subject that has been dear to my heart and my mind for about the last 15 years, which is the notion of the bishop as the Sponsus ecclesiae particularis. Means the bishop as the bridegroom of the local church. The word sponsus in Latin we ought to translate basically as bridegroom. It refers to the man in the spousal relationship with his fiancée from the period of their commitment to marriage until they come together at the wedding. So it's really kind of like the word fiancé or betrothed in English. That's what sponsus means. And my talk, as you'll see, will really focus on the notion of the church as a kind of a family, which is quite interesting because we've heard some magnificent talks in the last couple of days. I think of Fred and Lisa Everett's tremendous talk on the church of the home, searching for fairest love. So we have the church of the home, the family as the domestic church. But my talk really kind of runs the equation in the opposite direction, not the family as a domestic church, but the church as family, the church, the family structures that exist in the church. So again, as I said, it's indeed a great honor for me to speak about this topic. As I said, the theme of our conference is the family and the different ways in which the traditional notion of the family is central to Western and indeed to Christian thought. But in Christianity, the notion of the family is not restricted simply to the fundamental importance of the relationship between one man and one woman and their children. Indeed, Christianity, in continuity with Judaism, but in a far more developed and extensive manner, employs familial concepts in the articulation of the variety of relationships that come into being from the new life at baptism. It is these relationships which structure the church. Fundamental to the Christian economy is a relationship of what we might call ecclesial, and that means church, fraternity. A relationship which knows no distinction really between brothers and sisters. By baptism, we are all made, in a certain sense, siblings together, in which there's really, as St. Paul says, no male or female. We are all siblings in the church in that sense. But it's not only siblinghood, the concept of siblinghood, if you will, that's spiritualized in the Christian revelation, but parenthood is as well. Relationships of authority and governance in the church from the New Testament on are represented as a kind of spiritual paternity of the bishop and so forth. And so paternity, fatherhood, is spiritualized, is brought to a higher level, to a sacramental level in a different sense in the Christian economy. The third form of human family relationships, so we have siblinghood, parenthood. Third would be obviously marriage. And it's this relationship which is the subject of the present lecture. So I propose to outline very briefly how the notion of the bishop as the Sponsus, as I said, the bridegroom of his local church, how it emerged and developed in the course of the first 900 years of Christian history. But before doing so, I'd like to, in order to make this talk slightly relevant, I would like to note how this idea has been used in our own time. The incidents, the uses of the notion of the spousal relationship between the bishop and his diocese, his local church, the community of the people of God. And to do this, I would like to turn to the discussions of the Second Vatican Council, where the specific idea of the spousal relationship between the bishop and his church, between the bishop and his diocese, was indeed debated. In November of 1963, at the Second Vatican Council, Cardinal Sunens of Brussels spoke to the assembled bishops in the council hall in favor of the proposal that diocesan bishops be required, or at least invited, to retire once they had reached a certain age, something which hitherto in the Catholic Church was unknown. The proposal of the bishop's retirement had been debated the day before Cardinal Sunens spoke, and that day before it had been forcefully criticized among some of the fathers of the Second Vatican Council as an idea that was fundamentally opposed to, and I quote one of the comments, the firm and immemorial tradition that a residential bishop is indissolubly married to his see. Of course, see is another word, it means the chair, it means the diocese. Indissolubly married to his see. A Benedictine monk, the Archabbot Benedict Rates, specified that the residential bishop, the diocesan bishop, as the shepherd and the father of his diocese, is permanently bound to his local church. And now I quote, he spoke in Latin, and I'm translating into English. He said, it's bound, quote, as if by a marriage bond, which is dissolved only by his death, as is clearly stated in the consecration or the ordination of the bishop in the Roman Pontifical, which is the book of the prayers when the bishop is ordained. The bishop, Archabbot Rates said, wears his ring, the ring of fidelity, on his finger as the bridegroom of the church that has been entrusted to him, close quote. So that was the day before. The following day, Cardinal Sunens expressed his opinion in favor of the proposal that bishops retire at a certain age. And he caused considerable amusement in the Second Vatican Council, in the aula, in St. Peter's Basilica, when he responded to the spousal argument that had been used the day before. He said, again, I quote, some council fathers have invoked the principle of indissolubility in the marriage entered into between the bishop and the people entrusted to him. But this and he looked around probably quite dramatically, and he said, but this council hall is filled with divorced bishops. Some as many as 2 or 3 times. So he said, these principles should not be insisted upon. Above all, they should not make us forget other principles which perhaps are more decisive. doesn't the gospel itself, he said, as well as the apostolic and sub-apostolic tradition, instruct us that our ministry as bishops is to be a service for the good of souls, close quote. So as you probably know, the outcome of that discussion was the adoption of the position espoused by Cardinal Sunens. And as a result, when the Vatican II decree on the pastoral office of bishops in the Church, Christus Dominus, was promulgated 2 years later in 1965, it included the provision that when the increasing burden of age or some other serious reason makes bishops less capable of fulfilling their duties properly, they are, quote, earnestly requested to offer their resignation, close quote, either at their own initiative or upon the initiative of the competent authority, meaning Rome, meaning the Vatican. In 1983, then almost 20 years later, this provision was incorporated into the new Code of Canon Law in Canon 401 paragraph 1, which asks bishops to submit their letter of resignation to Rome when they're 75, and those resignations are then immediately accepted. In some cases are delayed and then accepted later. In 1999, now we'll go forward about 30 years. In 1999, 30 years after the promulgation of Christus Dominus, another cardinal, Cardinal Gantine, an African cardinal who went to God last year, had just completed his 12 years as the prefect of the Congregation of Bishops, the head of that office in Rome that makes bishops and also that transfers bishops. And after 12 years of that work, he gave an interview in which he expressed unease with the frequency of episcopal transfer in the Latin Church. Episcopal transfer means moving a bishop from one diocese to another. He expressed some unease about it, and he stated the principle that, in principle, bishops ought to remain in the diocese for which they were ordained. Cardinal Gantine justified this opinion by explaining that the relationship, and I quote, between bishop and diocese is also portrayed as a marriage. And a marriage, according to the spirit of the gospel, is indissoluble, close quote. However, notwithstanding the evident misgivings of Cardinal Gantine regarding the frequency of episcopal transfer, when the lengthy directory for the pastoral ministry of bishops, this is another document, was published in 2004, it's called Apostolorum Successores. It's kind of a document that describes the responsibilities of the bishop. It was published by the Congregation for Bishops in 2004 under Cardinal Gantine's successor, Cardinal Ray, who's the current prefect. That document contained only a single fleeting reference to the idea of the bishop as sposo della Chiesa, bridegroom of the church, Sponsus ecclesiae, and left the idea completely undeveloped in treating the identity, the mission, and the spirituality of the bishop. The transfer of bishops, on the other hand, was treated in that document as a matter of course, as a routine thing. So the lack of any elaboration of the spousal understanding of the office of the bishop in this directory for bishops published in 2004 in the last years of the pontificate of John Paul II is, however, consistent with the fact that the image of the bishop as sponsus, as bridegroom, did not figure largely in the magisterium of Pope John Paul II. At first sight, this fact seems a bit incongruous, since perhaps the most notable theological doctrinal contributions of his pontificate can be found in his rich and extensive explanation of the spousal meaning of the human body in those Wednesday General Catecheses delivered between September 1979 and November 1984, and about which Michael Waldstein is speaking right now in another room. It is therefore somewhat paradoxical that the specific idea of the bishop's spousal relationship to the church was left relatively undeveloped in the magisterium of John Paul II. At the same time, however, the broader and, I would say, derivative conceptualization of the spousal role of the priest in the church, especially in the context of the celebration of the Eucharist, appears in the great apostolic letter, which has been cited many times during our conference, Mulieris Dignitatem, and it receives more extensive consideration in the post-synodal apostolic exhortation Pastores Dabo Vobis, which spoke of a spousal relationship between the presbyter, that means the priest, and his community. It's curious that in such a context, the idea of the bishop as spouse of his local church did not receive much elaboration. But the reason, seems to me, may be found once again in the response of Cardinal Sunens back in 1983. this council hall is filled with divorced and remarried bishops, some as many as 2 and 3 times. In other words, the sign value of the bishop's spousal relationship to his church is difficult to assert in a context in which bishops regularly and routinely move from diocese to diocese. Cardinal Gantine was not the only person uncomfortable with the current praxis. Recently, the Jesuit theologian Michael Buckley has argued that, and I quote, "The Church should restore the enduring commitment of the bishop to his see. The Church should reaffirm strongly and effectively the ancient canonical prohibition that forbids a bishop leaving one see and going to another." Citing the historical study, this is Michael Buckley, of a certain Hamilton Hess, in order to show that already by the 4th century, the bishop was, quote, "considered bound to his people by a mystical union that was expressed as being akin to the marriage bond," close quote, Buckley indicated that the reasons for the need to revive the ancient discipline are both practical, to forestall, and I quote, "an endless source of clerical ambition, rivalry, and self-promotion," close quote, and theological, because the current practice is, and I quote again from Michael Buckley, "a violation of the union which should exist between the bishop and the people of his diocese." But it was not only in the context of the debate over the retirement of bishops that the notion of the spousal relationship between the bishop and the local church was invoked in the period before or the close of the Second Vatican Council, the period of the Second Vatican Council. There were 2 additional areas in which this idea was utilized, and both of them are quite controversial. First, the question of the possibility of ordaining women to the priesthood. Prior to the debate at the Second Vatican Council regarding the retirement of bishops, so before that, the theology of the spousal relationship between the bishop and the local church had also emerged as an element in a debate which would become far more heated, though never at the council itself, than that of the mandatory retirement of bishops. In 1962, at the University of Innsbruck, a Dutch Jesuit, Herr van der Meer, completed his thesis under the direction of Karl Rahner, entitled Theological Investigations on the Thesis that the subject of ordination can only be a man. And this was later published in 1969. As the title indicates, the work was a theological analysis of the idea that only men can be ordained to the ministerial priesthood. As part of his research, van der Meer had read an article by another German theologian named Engelbert Krebs, published in Germany between the 2 wars, which made reference to the spousal relationship between the bishop and church, symbolized once again by the ring worn by the bishop, indicative of the mystical connection between the office of the priest and the fact that the priest needs to be male. With Krebs' insight as his starting point, van der Meer went on to address the argumentation against women's ordination based on the representational, or we might call it iconic, quality of the bishop as an image of Christ the bridegroom espoused to his church. But van der Meer concluded with essentially the same argument as Cardinal Suenens again. Sacramental marriage, the sacrament of marriage, is indeed a concrete enactment of the spousal relationship between Christ and the church. But the notion of the bishop as the bridegroom of his diocese cannot be so in the same way, for if it were so, the bishop's relationship to his church could not be dissolved, and he couldn't be moved. In the post-conciliar church, while the notion of the priest as image of Christ the bridegroom has been used with some frequency to explain the inability of the church to ordain women to the ministerial priesthood, I would ask you to look, for example, at Sarah Butler's recent book on the Catholic priesthood and women, A Guide to the Teaching of the Church, in which she analyzes this argument. The most historically grounded element in that argument, the notion of the bishop as the spouse of the local church, again, has not been widely used in support of the argument. Priest, yes; bishop, not so much. It's worthy of mention, however, that in the Anglican communion in the Church of England, where the admission of women to ministerial priesthood has now led to a debate over the ordination of women as bishops, the opponents of this innovation in the Church of England have argued against it based, and I quote from one of them, based on, quote, the nuptial mystery of Christ and his church, and the relationship between the bishop and his local church, which, by virtue of his office, he is espoused. The second area is priestly celibacy. In addition to the questions of resignation of bishops, transfer of bishops, and the theological explanation of the church's restriction of ministerial priesthood to men, the notion of the spousal relationship between a bishop and his local church was also invoked in the period of Second Vatican Council in connection with the debate regarding the continued validity of obligatory celibacy for Latin Rite priests. As early as 1961, Cardinal Lienhard, the Archbishop of Lille in the north of France, alarmed, and this is 1961, imagine, about the controversies about priestly celibacy, arranged for the publication of a brief study on the priesthood and celibacy. This study included a brief section on episcopal celibacy, bishop celibacy, developed from the standpoint of the bishop as the image of Christ, head and bridegroom of the church. Once again, the argument was made that the identity of the bishop as representative of Christ, the bridegroom, as expressed in the prayer of the Roman Pontifical over the bishop's ring when he is ordained, makes this argument quite clear. The authors cited also Thomas Aquinas in his commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard to the effect that the bishop is in a special way, and I quote, the bridegroom of the church, as is Christ the bridegroom of the church, close quote. And this study by Lienhard concluded in 1961 that, and again I quote, the union of the bishop with the church and with his particular church has a solemn character and is in itself irrevocable. It is the fruit and the expression of a total love. This is why it excludes a human spousal relationship. So the fact that the bishop is espoused to the church is the reason why he cannot be married. This introductory overview illustrates the way in which the theological concept of the spousal relationship between the bishop and church has been utilized in a variety of theological contexts in the period of the Second Vatican Council and after, specifically, as I've said, in reference to the questions of episcopal resignation, women's ordination, and sacerdotal priestly celibacy. But, and here's the question, where did this idea of the bishop as married to his diocese, to his local church, come from? The notion of the spousal relationship between the bishop and his local church emerged unambiguously for the first time in Egypt near the middle of the 4th century in the context of the fierce polemics of the Arian controversy, in the specific case of Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, the great Athanasius. The historical circumstances of this emergence are well known, although the details continue to be debated by historians. In May of 337, Emperor Constantine died. Almost immediately, an order was issued in the name of the new emperors, which decreed that all exiled bishops were to return to their sees, to their local churches. Athanasius, who had been resident in Trier, in Germany, imagine that, Egyptian bishop living in Germany in that time, it shows how universal the Catholic Church was at that time. Since he had been exiled from Alexandria by a synod of bishops that was held 2 years earlier in 335, Athanasius left Trier and headed straight towards Alexandria, to his bride, his church. Since Constantine had not authorized the appointment of a new bishop in Alexandria during the period of Athanasius' exile, Athanasius' opponents, led by a certain Eusebius of Nicomedia, they seem to have reacted to the news of his imminent return by convoking a synod which promptly, as you can imagine, elected a rival bishop for Alexandria. Upon his arrival then in Alexandria, Athanasius responded by calling a synod of his own, which met in either 338 or 339, depending how we, some complex questions of dating, 338 or 339, and that synod, held in Alexandria, declared Athanasius the rightful bishop of the city. This synod also took upon itself the task of refuting the charges that had been made against Athanasius at that earlier synod of Tyre when he had been exiled. Then a synodal letter was written, approved by all the bishops in attendance at the synod, and sent to the Bishop of Rome as well as to the imperial authorities, in which the legitimacy of Athanasius's claim to the Diocese of Alexandria was reasserted and defended. But not content simply to offer a defense of Athanasius, the synodal letter also criticized his principal opponent, Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, for having abandoned the local church for which he had originally been ordained bishop, and for having not once, but twice, moved on to other churches. First from what is now modern Beirut to where he was, Nicomedia, and then from Nicomedia on to Constantinople. So three dioceses in a row. The synodal letter was probably written in 338 by Athanasius himself. It was certainly inspired by him. And quoting St. Paul's words on the choice between marriage and celibacy, when St. Paul says in the first letter of the Corinthians, chapter 7, verse 27, "Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be freed." The letter applies this injunction to the relationship, for the first time, between the local church and the office of bishop. Leaving one church for another is identified as adultery. And I quote from the letter, which is written in Greek. "Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be freed." That's from St. Paul. If this is said of a wife, how much more can it be said of a church and her episcopate? He who is joined to her should not seek another, lest he prove to be an adulterer, according to Holy Scripture. Close quote. With these words, the bishops of the Synod of Alexandria gave expression to a concept that, as we have seen, would have enduring consequences in the history of the Catholic Church. The relationship between bishop and local church is like that between husband and wife, and unfaithfulness in this relationship can justly be described as adultery. The symbolic import and doctrinal consequences of this description can hardly be overstated, because perhaps more than any other single social factor, the Christian community which had emerged in the Roman Empire of the 1st and 2nd centuries had, in continuity and fidelity to the teachings of Christ himself in the New Testament, deliberately identified itself through and in its code of marital behavior. Christians distinguished themselves from the pagan world by virtue of their fidelity in marriage. Undoubtedly, then, the identification of illegitimate diocese changing with adultery, as proposed in the Synod letter of 338, was an equation designed to carry the maximum rhetorical weight. It was, moreover, a comparison which may not have been completely unfamiliar to those to whom the letter was addressed. It's significant, for example, that the description is introduced rather abruptly in the text without extended introduction or subsequent explanation, which would indicate that the notion of the spousal relationship between the bishop and the local church was, in all probability, already present in theological reflection before this time, although we have no written textual evidence of that. In light of this observation, it becomes important for us now to ask what the antecedents for this identification of bishop as bridegroom, as husband, might have been, and to inquire how this idea may have developed in the first 3 centuries of the Christian era. As I said, the synodal letter of Alexandria had called attention to the fact that Eusebius, Athanasius' principal opponent, had first been bishop, what is now Beirut, but had left his local church, contrary to the law, and gone off to Nicomedia. The condemnation of Eusebius' actions as unlawful was probably meant as a reference to Canon 15 of the Council of Nicaea, which had forbidden bishops, priests, and deacons to move from one local church to another. The council simply forbade them to do so, told them to stay in the diocese for which they were ordained, and it said it did this, it made this law on account of much disorder that had been created. It doesn't give a theological explanation. This is the Council of Nicaea in 325. So this idea of the bishop as indissolubly united to his church was very clearly stated in Nicaea in this Canon 15, although an explanation is not given. But as I said, Athanasius' criticism of Eusebius did not remain solely on the level of canon law, but it also invoked ascetical principles as well in denouncing Eusebius' actions. The synodal letter explains that Eusebius falling in love, had abandoned his local church and irrationally or unjustly, alogos, means against the logos, taken possession of a church that belonged to another. He disregarded, this is Eusebius, the love which he ought to have had for his first church. And in his lustful desire, and the Greek is epithumia, which is the same word that Jesus talks about someone who looks with lust on a woman, right? In his lustful desire, he had taken someone else's church. The letter's criticism of Eusebius focuses rhetorically on his failure in loving affection for his own church. And the word it uses for this loving affection is storge, which is, storge is first and fundamentally a family virtue, a family love, denoting the affectionate love between parents and children. Significantly, storge, this kind of love, one of C.S. Lewis's four loves, significantly, storge had been employed by Eusebius of Caesarea in recounting the martyrdom of Polycarp to describe the loving affection of the Christian people for Polycarp, their bishop, as they attempted to help him elude capture by the authorities before his eventual martyrdom. The term was also used in another 3rd century epistula Clementis to describe the proper attitude that Christian people should have towards their bishop, storge, a family virtue, family love, love for parents, parents for children. Athanasius' use of the word in the synodal letter is meant to portray his opponent Eusebius as one who is lacking in the fundamental attitude of familial and paternal affection, which a paterfamilias, and the Greek for that is the oiko despotes, the head of the family in the Greco-Roman world, was expected to have for the members of his household and they for him. In addition, the synodal letters reference to Eusebius casting, as I said, a glance of desire, epithumia, at another church, as I said earlier, is intended to recall the words of Jesus himself condemning one who looks at a woman in order to desire her in Matthew 5:28. So it's clear that Athanasius is constructing an indictment of Eusebius based on the concept of the bishop as the ideal paterfamilias, the loving and faithful head of the household. Therefore, the background to Athanasius' identification of the church as the spouse of the bishop was surely the New Testament notion of the episkopos, which is the Greek word for bishop, which literally means overseer or supervisor, the episkopos as the husband of one wife and the father of a family. That's in 1 Timothy 3:2 and Titus 1:6, but especially 1 Timothy 3:2. The bishop is supposed to be the husband of one wife. And Athanasius constructs this on the basis of the comparison between the Greco-Roman oikos, which is the household, the house, and the entire household, which would be the servants, the family, parents, children, and so forth. The bishop as the ideal oikodespotes, head of the family, presiding over the local church as the oikos, the household of the bishop. This was the notion, and this notion was very common in the early church. But why is it, and we can ask ourselves, that this conceptualization of the bishop as the husband or spouse of his local church only appears in the 4th century, almost 3 centuries after the description in the pastoral epistles, as I said, in 1 Timothy, of the bishop as the head of a family? To answer this question, we have to look at the ascetical monastic movement of the 3rd and 4th century Egypt, a period in which an increasing number of unmarried ascetics and monks were being chosen to be bishops. In the early church, many married men were ordained to the episcopate. I'll speak about that in a moment. In the 4th century, we have an increasing number of unmarried ascetics. This is after the period of persecution, when the whole ascetical movement, the monastic movement, begins to take off in the church. Unmarried ascetics are being chosen as bishops. In such a situation, and this is kind of my important point here, in which the bishop has no human spouse, the local church assumes the theological configuration of the wife of the bishop. In particular, in situations in which the bishop was unjustly exiled or an attempt was made to replace him with someone else. This is a very important point which needs to be stressed. It's clear that in the first millennium, married men were ordained to the priesthood, actually diaconate, priesthood, and to the episcopate. it needs to be borne in mind, however, that the unanimous tradition in the first millennium is that once ordained, the bishop ceased marital relations with his wife. So after ordination, he no longer lived as husband and wife with his wife. So the emergence of the idea of the bishop as the spiritual spouse of his church was dependent upon these two prior developments: the New Testament notion of the bishop as the head of the household, and the 4th century prevalence of unmarried bishops. A third factor was also significant, however, and this is the whole idea of spiritual sponsality, which is first applied to consecrated virgins in the church. It was with Tertullian in the late 2nd and early 3rd century that the notion of the spousal relationship between Christ, the bridegroom, and the church's bride came to be applied not only to the body of the church as a whole, but indeed to the individual members of the church, specifically as a way of describing the vocation of the consecrated virgin. Which in that time of the church's history was essentially very similar to religious life, sisters and nuns in our contemporary church. It is an application which was tremendously important. This idea of the virgin as the spouse of Christ. It was taken up and expanded by later Christian writers such as Cyprian and passed into the common Christian tradition. And here we come to an important point as well. Only well after the notion of the consecrated virgin as espoused to Christ, which is an image of the church, espoused to Christ, only after that was concretized in the church, Tertullian, Origen, 2nd and 3rd centuries, do we later find the corresponding notion, the asymmetric notion we might call it, of the bishop as the spouse of his local church. One can say then that it was, in a spiritual sense, by contemplating the vocation of the consecrated unmarried virgin, understood as the spouse of Christ, that the early Christians came slowly to understand the vocation of the unmarried bishop in a corresponding sense as the spouse of the local church. The evidence after Athanasius. After its appearance in Athanasius, there were additional references in the churches of the East to the idea of the bishop as the husband of his church. These references were all motivated by concrete situations and always in connection with bishops who were unmarried, who had no human wife. Athanasius, Abraham of Nisibis, Gregory of Nazianzus, Meletius of Antioch, John Chrysostom, for example. Again, in these cases, in which the bishop had no human wife, spousal terminology was used in relation to his particular local church, his diocese, consonant with the idea of the local church as a household, as an oikos. That's in the Eastern Church. In the Western Church, however, during the patristic period, the evidence regarding the concept is more diversified. First, although the notion is unequivocally present in the West at the end of the 4th century, so that's only 50 years after Athanasius, as evidenced by a papal decretal called Ad Gallos Episcopos, which speaks of the spousal relationship between the bishop and the church, there was considerable resistance in the West to the use of spousal terminology for the relationship of the bishop to the church among some significant theological writers. This resistance is evident in Jerome, and most especially in Augustine, whose opposition to any application of the category of spiritual sponsality to the bishop's relationship to his community may have been due to the use of such a concept among Augustine's Donatist heretical opponents. It's my belief, and I can't completely prove it, that the Donatists seem to have had this idea of a spiritual marriage between a Donatist bishop and his Donatist diocese. And Augustine, and this is absolutely clear, is totally opposed to the idea. For Augustine, in any case, the effect of Augustine's opposition would be the creation of a conceptual division in Western theology with respect to the spousal description of the bishop, between, on the one hand, the bishop as the faithful bridegroom or husband espoused to his local church, which is what we've been talking about, and on the other, the Augustinian idea of the bishop not as the bridegroom, at all, but rather as the friend of the bridegroom, taking off from John 3:29, the amicus sponsi, not the sponsus, but the amicus sponsi, the friend of the bridegroom, who listens and hears the bridegroom's voice. The amicus sponsi, whose job is to lead the bride, the church, his church, to Christ, her only spouse. Her only spouse. This division between we say the Eastern and the Western, or the Augustinian and the Athanasian positions, will continue to manifest itself in the subsequent history of the question of in the theology of the early Middle Ages in the West. After the appearance of the idea of the spousal relationship between bishop and local church in Athanasius, for whom the relationship was compared to marriage, now I'm going to make another distinction. In Athanasius, the relationship is compared to marriage, as we saw from the text at which I've read. One also finds theological attempts to describe the relationship, the spousal relationship between the bishop and his church, in terms which are spousal but deliberately not marital. What do I mean by spousal but not marital? Throughout the historical period which is the focus of our study, becoming married, getting married, was a process, not simply limited as it is today in Catholic canon law to the moment of the exchange of vows at the wedding ceremony. Indeed, becoming married was a series of steps in which there were two fundamental stages: betrothal, sponsatio, by promise. You promise to marry, usually an agreement between families in which the young people always had the ability to say yes or no to the proposal of marriage. But being espoused, betrothed, and which was followed by, later on, cohabitation as man and wife. So the consent or assent to marriage was given with betrothal, but then they would come together to live, and that coming together was usually celebrated by a big feast, a big party, which was the wedding celebration. But the wedding celebration, most of this history, was not the moment in which they said, I do, but it was the consequence of an earlier promise. So that's, in all probability then, the descriptions then of the relationship between the bishop and the church, which were spousal but not fully marital, were descriptions in which this pre-matrimonial stage of betrothal was used as the analogy to the bishop's relationship with the church. The pre-matrimonial period of betrothal, or what we now call engagement, was used as the image of his relationship with the church. In all probability, these descriptions arose out of a concern to reconcile the idea of the local church as the spouse of the bishop with the frequent descriptions in the New Testament of the church as both virgin and bride, which would seem to be foreclosed by the description of the local church as the wife of the bishop. The wife, by definition, is no longer a virgin, right? This current of interpretation is apparent in the theology of Gregory of Nyssa, whose spousal descriptions of the relationship between the bishop and the local church consistently refer to the bishop as a nuptios, a sponsus, bridegroom of local church, a description which consciously made use of the category of betrothal as a fully spousal, yet virginal, pre-matrimonial image of that relationship. In addition to the marital and betrothal imagery used respectively by John Chrysostom, who used marital imagery, Gregory of Nyssa, who used betrothal imagery, another way of conceptualizing the relationship between the bishop and his local church in spousal terms appeared in the West, beginning with Ambrose. The elaboration of the local church and her relationship to her bishop, not in simple comparison with the spousal relationship between the husband and the wife, but rather in relationship to the Marian identity of the church as virgin, spouse, and mother. So the church as an image of Mary, who is at the same time virgin, spouse, and mother. And the description or the analogy went like this: as the Virgin Mary was espoused to Joseph, yet became a physical mother through the action of the Holy Spirit, so the virginal church is espoused to a bishop through the action, is espoused to the bishop and made fruitful, made productive in a sense by her divine bridegroom, by Christ. So the bishop has a spousal relationship to her, but her true husband, in a sense, is Christ. This perspective is echoed in the West in homilies of Peter Chrysologus, and later appears in a beautiful way in the exegetical work of Venerable Bede in England. In these writers, the bishop's relationship to the church is presented as spousal, but not marital. An additional factor to which we have already alluded in referring to the ascetical monastic context of the theology of Athanasius also enters into the history of the evolution of this concept. And this is the question of what we might call ministerial continence, which is not a very nice word, but which needs to be carefully distinguished from the question of clerical marriage. A quick word about this distinction. Properly speaking, because an immense amount of confusion arises from confusion about these words. Properly speaking, traditionally, the term celibacy and celibate mean unmarried. They mean unmarried. While the terms traditionally in Latin, continence and continent, mean sexually abstinent. Sexually abstinent. As I have said, the presence of married bishops was certainly one of the reasons for the slow and intermittent development of the idea of the bishop as the spouse of his church, and explains why the notion was initially applied only with regard to circumstances of specific unmarried bishops. The emergence of the idea of the bishop as the spouse of his church only becomes possible, as I said before, once unmarried bishops coming from this ascetical monastic background become relatively common. In addition, once the idea of the spousal relationship between an unmarried bishop and his church was asserted, the spousal relationship between an unmarried bishop and his local church, once that is asserted, it's not surprising that the idea then comes to be used to explain why a married bishop should live in sexual abstinence with his wife, in continence. Well, I prefer to say sexual abstinence because it's probably a more restrictive term. This application is apparent in the discussion of the obligation of episcopal continence in the case of married bishops in a treatise that probably comes from the 5th century called De Septem Ordinibus Ecclesiae, on the 7 orders of the church, where the manner in which a bishop was to treat his human wife, that is by loving her but living in sexual abstinence with her, is modeled and explained and justified by the bishop's spousal relationship to his church. Within the category of the bishop as the spouse of the local church, a further element requires mention. In addition to the image of the bishop constructed on the basis of the comparison with the Greco-Roman oikos, with the idea of the bishop as the paterfamilias, a conceptualization of the bishop also as the image or the representation or the icon of Christ also develops early in the tradition. In the West, it is only in the 7th century that one begins to find an explicit parallelism between the spousal relationship of Christ and the church and the bishop and his local church. Before that, it's more bishop as the head of the family. Not, so in a sense, an image drawn from human relations, not an image drawn from the supernatural relationship between Christ and the church. The introduction of the concept of the bishop as an image of Christ, the bridegroom, espoused to the church, is found for the first time in the West in the writings of Pope Theodore, who died in 649, who himself came from the East to the West, one of a series of Greek-speaking popes in the late 7th and 8th centuries. In the Carolingian church, that means the church of the 9th century in the Frankish territories, the concept of the spousal relationship between the bishop and the church suddenly becomes very widespread. So as I said, in the West, it was hampered by Augustine's resistance, but then for some reason in the 9th century, it begins to flourish. The fundamental reason for this flourishing in the 9th century in the West was the fact that the 9th century Frankish church very consciously attempted to recover the early tradition of the fathers, the early tradition of the church. And in this process of recovery, an early canonical text which forbade a presbyter, a priest, to abandon his wife, forbidding a priest to leave his wife, and which had originally been intended to protect the wives of men who were ordained to the priesthood or the episcopate from being discarded by their husbands after his ordination, referred in this text to the wife of the priest or the wife of the bishop, the uxor presbyteri, the uxor episcopi. That was interpreted in an allegorical way in the 9th century to mean that a priest should not abandon his spiritual uxor, his spiritual wife, that is his parish. So we see only in the 9th century do we see the first evidence in the West of the spousal relationship between a priest and his parish, which is derivative of the fundamental notion of the bishop espoused to his church, because of course the bishop is the priest to the fullness. In the 9th century as well, with this interpretation, a remarkable, we could say, cross-fertilization takes place in Western theology between the notion of the human spouse of the bishop and the conceptualization of the local church. As I've mentioned, early in the tradition, in the 5th or possibly 7th century text, De Septem Ordinibus Ecclesiae, the notion of the church as the virginal spouse of the bishop had influenced the way in which he was required to live with his human wife, namely virginally. In the 9th century, the opposite takes place. A canon which originally described how the bishop is to treat his human wife influences the conceptualization of his relationship to the church by giving rise to the idea of the church, that the church can be seen not simply as the sponsa, as his bride, but also as his wife, as uxor episcopi, as the wife of the bishop. This formulation led in the 9th century to a strongly marital conceptualization of the relationship between the bishop and the church, as opposed to the other models of the relationship based on, as I said, premarital betrothal or the Marian virginal identity of the church. Within this context, it became possible for authors such as one of the forged letters in the famous pseudo-Isidorian decretals to draw an explicit parallelism between the exclusive right of a local bishop to ordain clerics for his local church, only he can do that, and the exclusive right of a husband to concubitus, which means sleeping together with his wife. So this kind of strongly marital conceptualization, kind of abandoning betrothal imagery, but shifting it towards a more marital imagery in the 9th century in the Western Church, really because of this reading of a canonical text which spoke of the wife of the priest, wife of the bishop. The original context, though, was the human wife of the bishop, understood in the 9th century in an allegorical way as the spiritual wife of the bishop. It's also in the 9th century that we find the first prayer references to the bishop's ring as a spousal symbol in the 9th century in the Western Church in a pontifical from Sens in France. In these prayers, one finds the idea of the bishop not as the spouse of the church, but rather more in the Augustinian sense of the one who takes care of and protects the sponsa Christi, the spouse of Christ. The original prayers of the bishop's ring, and even the prayers that are still used, point more to the bishop as the one who's taking care of the spouse of Christ or the spouse of God, not his own spouse. So the ring, the bishop's ring in its original signification is not really a wedding ring between the bishop and his diocese. It's more of a pledge that he will protect and guide the spouse of Christ, or in later prayers, the spouse of God, to her heavenly bridegroom. The 9th century, however, witnessed another innovation beyond that of the assertion of a spousal relationship between the simple priest and his parish, and also beyond this interpretation of the bishop's ring as signifying his job to take care of the spouse of Christ. The other interesting innovation in the 9th century was the first time we have the election of a bishop in Rome who had already been fully active as a bishop of another city. As I've already noted, in the early church, episcopal transfer was forbidden, and this prohibition was observed in the city of Rome right up until the end of the 9th century. So for almost half of our tradition, we never had a pope who had already been a bishop. He was either a deacon or a priest, or even a layman, chosen, ordained bishop of Rome, but never taken from another diocese because of this idea of the spousal relationship between the bishop and his diocese. This changes with the election of Pope Formosus in 891. His election, which was contested after his death as a violation of the spousal relationship between the bishop and the local church, prepared the ground for the acceptance of the idea that a bishop could be chosen for the See of Rome, that a bishop could be chosen to be pope. But it only happens in the year 891. The story of Formosus is quite scandalous. He's a poor fellow that after he died, the pope died, he was dug up by his opponent and tried after his death in an absurd cadaver synod, they call it. and was convicted because his responses weren't very lively. And he was tossed into the Tiber, actually. I will close by briefly trying to harmonize in a theological way. I've kind of gone through very quickly the evidence of the first millennium. And I'll try quickly at the end here to present a little theological attempt at harmonization of this. It's now almost 45 years after Cardinal Sunens argued in the context of the debate of the resignation of diocesan bishops that the Church's praxis of episcopal transfer makes the idea of the marriage between the bishop and the Church obsolete and unconvincing. In Sunen's view, the idea of the spiritual matrimonium between the bishop and the local church was not something that ought to stand in the way of the good of the Catholic people. The intervening decades, however, have not, at least in my view, provided irrefutable evidence that the setting aside of this notion has been of any great benefit to the Church or to the good of souls. So in light of the theological insights of the first millennium, we might ask, is there a theological response to the argument of Cardinal Sunens? As we have mentioned, Augustine was a critic of the application of spousal terminology to the relationship between the bishop and the local church, while John Chrysostom, on the other hand, portrayed his entrance into the episcopate as a kind of marriage with the universal church, and subsequently referred to his church of Constantinople as his faithful wife when he was repeatedly exiled. Is one forced to choose between the theology of Augustine on the one hand and that of John Chrysostom on the other? Are they mutually exclusive? In responding to this question, one must first acknowledge that there can be no doubt regarding the legitimacy of Augustine's position, solidly rooted as it is in the New Testament. Christ is the bridegroom of the church, and the task of the bishop is to lead the bride, the Christian people, to Christ, the one bridegroom. One fundamental difference between the notion of the bishop as the friend of the bridegroom, in the Augustinian sense, who leads the bride to Christ, and the idea of the bishop as in some sense the Sponsus ecclesiae, resides on the level of signification or on the level of symbol. From a theological standpoint, the notion of the bishop who protects the church and leads her to Christ, the single bridegroom, is univocal, it's literal in its signification. That's literally what the bishop does. The notion, on the other hand, of the bishop as the spouse of his church is symbolic, it's sacramental. And as such, like all symbols, like all sacraments, it's temporary, because bishops only last for a while. Here we begin to see the possibility of reconciling these two conceptualizations. I would have proposed that the solution is suggested in the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament. Throughout the New Testament, the church, in various ways, is depicted as a virginal bride. It's only in the book of the Apocalypse, in other words, the Revelation, right, the last book of the Bible, in Revelation 19:7, that the New Testament portrays the church explicitly as gune, as a wife, for the first time, in the sense of a married woman. Because it's only there that, and I quote from Revelation, the wife has made herself ready. She's made herself ready. This is in the end, in the apocalypse, the vision of heaven. And the time, quote, the wedding feast, the wedding of the Lamb has begun. The wedding has begun, the wedding of the Lamb. It's only in the eschaton, in the end, that the bridal church is also a wife. Revelation 21, verse 9. It's addressed to John, the Apostle John. Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. It's a very interesting phrase. Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. So it's sponsa, then uxor in Latin. I will show you the bride, but now she's the wife of the Lamb. That's at the end in the eschaton. As mentioned earlier, throughout the historical period, which has been the focus of our study, a distinction was made between these two fundamental aspects or stages of becoming married. Betrothal, desponsatio, by promise, followed by cohabitation as man and wife. So the distinction between bride and wife, sponsa and uxor, is absolutely fundamental. For the Christian, then, the vision in the book of the Apocalypse, in the 19th and the 21st chapters of the book of Revelation, where the church is portrayed not as nymphi, not as bride, but rather as gune, as wife, not as a sponsa, but rather as uxor, points to the ultimate reality and our deepest hope. the definitive and final oneness between God and his people, between Christ and the church. A final oneness sacramentally foreshadowed and expressed, that final oneness which is expressed not by betrothal, but by marriage. Here in the eschatological consummation of all things, the end, there will only be one bridegroom who will have become the husband of the church, his wife. The task of the bishop, indeed the reason for his episcopae, the reason for his oversight of the church, is to lead all the members of his particular church to that wedding banquet of the single spouse of the church, Christ the Lord. In the final analysis, this is the bishop's only mission, and for this reason, the theological intuition of Augustine that there can be only one bridegroom expresses the ultimate truth of Christian existence. As a theologian wrote in the 9th century named Agobard of Lyon, unus est sponsus qui habet sponsum. There's only one bridegroom who has the bride. In this eschatological perspective, the bishop's role as the one who leads the bride to the bridegroom has been expressed in various ways. As I said, the bishop as the friend of the bride, the friend of the bridegroom who leads and cares for the bride. This is the theology which in the 9th century prevailed in the introduction of liturgical prayers over the bishop's ring in the ceremony of the episcopal ordination. The prayer over the bishop's ring in that ordination, which dates from the 9th century and still in use today, expresses this idea when it says to the new bishop, "Receive this ring," that is to say, the seal of fidelity, so that adorned with spotless faith, you may chastely guard the holy bride of God, namely the church. Your job is to guard the bride of the church. The bishop is to care for the bride of God, never forgetting that she has been entrusted to him so that she will be presented to her divine bridegroom in all her baptismal beauty. This perspective of the spousal role of the bishop can be termed the spousal eschatological role of the bishop relative to the church in heaven, relative to the ecclesia in patria, the church in the heavenly homeland. But at the same time, there is that symbolic sacramental structure of the church on earth, the ecclesia in via peregrinans, the church on the way, pilgriming on the way, walking on the way. And in that church, and in our world, the bishop has a typological or iconic significance as one who expresses and represents Christ before the community of the church. And while the bishop cannot be seen as a representative of every image that Christ uses for himself in the Gospels, some images are more central and more intrinsic than others. No reality is more immediate to human life than the relationship of love between a man and a woman. Thus, it cannot be the case that the bishop's representation of Christ would fail to include, in some sense, this iconic representation of the Lord's own identity as Sponsus ecclesiae. And at the same time, a theological problem emerges when the local church is conceived as the uxor episcopi, right, as the wife of the bishop. When the local church is seen as the wife of the bishop, a problem emerges. And here it's important to recall the circumstances of the original articulation of the idea in Athanasius, where it was the inseparability of the bishop and the local church which was being asserted. In later presentations, as I mentioned, a strong parallelism was asserted between marriage and the bishop's relationship to the church. Of course, it's true that all analogies limp, but the fundamental problem with the strongly marital, as opposed to betrothal, conceptualization of the bishop's relationship to the church, is that such a designation makes the bishop's temporary relationship to his local church an image of a permanent and eternal reality which is still yet to come. As the book of Revelation makes clear, the bridal church is not yet the wife of the Lamb. She will be the wife of the Lamb only at the end of all time, when all things have been made new. If the church in via, the church on this earth, is sponsa, she's not yet uxor, she's the bride, not yet the wife, then the bishop, who only functions as the image of Christ for the church on the way, the church in this world, ought to be seen as a representative of Christ vis-a-vis the church as sponsus, as bridegroom, not as husband, right, as bridegroom. Furthermore, we've noted historically that there's a certain correspondence between the figure of the consecrated virgin and that of the bishop with regard to sponsality. The ancient tradition going back to the 3rd century witnesses to the fact that the virgin is espoused to Christ, but her relationship to the Lord is spousal in a way that's not marital. It's not by accident that the virgin is always termed sponsa Christi. She's never called uxor Christi. This, of course, is the reason why consecrated virginity is an eschatological sign. Not really because the virgin is a sign now of the church as uxor, as wife in the heavenly kingdom, but rather that her current bridal betrothed status evokes that reality, which is still yet to come. So like the church as sponsa, the betrothal of the virgin to Christ points to the future. The symmetry between the sign of the virgin and the sign of the bishop would seem to require that his relationship to the church be conceptualized as a betrothal rather than as a marriage. As a virgin is a sign of the bridal church, espoused or betrothed to the divine bridegroom in view of the eschatological matrimonium, so the bishop is a sign of Christ, the bridegroom, espoused to, but not yet eschatologically married to the church, his bride. Secondly, in the notion of the church as the wife, the notion of the church as the wife of the bishop would mean, as Cardinal Sunens observed back in 1963, that any case of episcopal transfer would somehow be illegitimate. If a husband can never put away his wife, how could a bishop ever be separated from his church? The history of the church in the first millennium has shown us clearly that episcopal transfer, while extremely rare and never viewed as something desirable or normal, was at the same time not viewed as impossible. Thirdly, and very significantly, the description of the church as the uxor episcopi, the wife of the bishop, runs counter to the important theological image of the church as virginal, and thus the church as imaged in the person of the Blessed Virgin Mary. St. Ambrose, as I mentioned, and later Venerable Bede, saw this clearly. He wrote, she, quote, the church is espoused to one, but made fruitful by another. De sponsata to one, but made fruitful by another. So it's for these reasons that the theological image of the bishop as betrothed, sponsus, but not married to his local church, must be preferred. It preserves the fullness of the spousal representation of Christ, which is so important. It respects the fact that the bishop is a sign of Christ now in the church in via, on the way, principally in the context of the celebration of the Eucharist, which itself, the Eucharist, in heavenly homeland, in the patria, will be no more, because in heaven there will be the reality of what now takes place in sign. In addition, the theological image of the bishop as betrothed sponsus admits the possibility of exceptional cases of episcopal transfer. The church of the first millennium recognized that betrothal was a solemn and sacred promise of spousal fidelity and love, but it also consistently recognized that there were cases in which, for serious reasons, betrothal could be dissolved. The same was true for episcopal transfer and ought to be true once more today. We may conclude then that the role of the bishop was as he who espouses the church to Christ the bridegroom is reflective of the ultimate end of his episcopal oversight. On the other hand, the image of the bishop himself as sponsus for the church in via, on the way to heaven, is valid to the extent to which it contributes to the achievement of that eschatological goal. When the image of the bishop as sponsus in any way hinders the luminosity of the more fundamental reality of Christ as sponsus, it loses precisely the representational quality which gives it value. The preference for betrothal rather than for marital imagery of the bishop's relationship to his church should be a constant reminder of the derivative and temporary nature of his role as sponsus, as bridegroom. St. Ambrose, as I said, noted that the local church is only joined to the visible figure of the bishop for a time. The bishop, as Ambrose says, is a sacerdos temporalis, temporary priest. He is a sponsus, but his sponsality is, by definition, incomplete, provisional. It points to something more, which is not temporary, but permanent, the end of all things, where, as St. Paul says in the first letter of Corinthians 15:28, God will be all in all. Thank you for your great patience listening to me for so long.
few minutes, but Monsignor Brown has indicated his willingness and desire to answer any questions that might come up.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a quick question, if I may dare to ask you to take Canon 15 and I say it a little bit further than you did. In relation to modern times, you began talking in the 4th century about monasticism and the way the monks would come out there to become a bishop. And again, I know you didn't get this, but in the 11th and 12th century, the same happened with Cluniac daughter houses. How would the difference be if bishops were ordained priests in the same diocese that they served as bishops? Instead of now we have our own bishop, John Michael Darcy. His Excellency comes from Boston and is now serving here, although he served here very, very faithfully. What difference would it be if he were ordained a priest in the same diocese that he served as bishop? Would that relationship to the people, that Sponsus, be more intense?
That's a great question. I honestly, frankly, don't think so, frankly, because we must remember that the bishop is the priest par excellence, right? He is the sacerdos. And a presbyter, a priest like me, is really an assistant, a helper of a bishop in his church. So when a bishop ordains me, for example, in New York, I don't have a spousal relationship to the Archdiocese of New York. The bishop does, and I assist him in that. So I don't see myself a difficulty, an ecclesiological or spousal difficulty in ordaining, and certainly the tradition is filled with priests from one place ordained throughout the unanimous tradition. Priests ordained the priesthood in one place and then ordained to the episcopate in another, simply because the priest par excellence, the priest in the fullness, is the bishop. So I wouldn't push Canon 15 in Nicaea as far as you might think I should. Yes.
Thank you, Monsignor Brown, for that carefully detailed analysis. And my question has to do with the bishop's pectoral cross. You talked very much about the ring and its significance, that it's not a wedding band. But I was wondering, looking at the pectoral cross that only the bishop wears, as the bridegroom that lays down his life for the church, his bride, that's why you do not see the corpus, because his body is the corpus. Is that true?
I think that's true. I think that I don't have in front of me the prayers of the pontifical over the cross, and I can't recall them at this moment. But I know that there is no explicit spousal significance given to the cross in the rite of episcopal ordination. But I agree that the symbol of the cross is a very iconic Christological symbol of the bishop. The bishop is Christ for us, an image of Christ, and as you said very well, that's why traditionally the cross he wears would not have the corpus of Christ on it. So I think it's an image of Christ, of the bishop as Christ for us, but I don't think that the tradition has a spousal interpretation given to it. That's one. There's one way in the back. Yeah.
I'm wondering what light your comments might shed on this custom of so-called auxiliary bishop.
There's a long tradition of auxiliary bishops, and I think that my own view, and it's an excellent question, would be that auxiliary bishops essentially function the way priests function in the diocese. They're there to help the ordinary, help the bishop. No one would assert that they have a spousal relationship to that local church. And indeed, most of the things that auxiliary bishops do, priests can be delegated to do. So I think my own view would be perhaps to delegate priests to do the things that auxiliary bishops are doing in dioceses, and perhaps not have as many auxiliary bishops as we have now. I would also say, though, that auxiliary bishops are always given a titular see by Rome when they're ordained to the episcopate. They're always given a kind of a fake diocese, in a sense. Some places have been overrun by Muslims in North Africa, or in the case of a dear friend of mine, Bishop Conley in Denver, a diocese that sunk into the Mediterranean Sea and is underwater. So they're given these dioceses that for some reason have no bishop in them as a kind of a titular see, but in order to retain that idea of the bishop in some sense as the bishop of a people, of a local church.
Please join me again and thank you, Monsignor.